Have we maybe overestimated how good Brighton are going to be this season, and have maybe the Albion slightly undercooked? Welcome to Seagulls Central. My name is Adam MacDonald, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thank you for clicking on this video. If you're new here, thank you so much for joining the channel. If you've been here before, welcome back to the fastest growing Brighton fan community out there on social media. I want to get into the discussion around our start of the season. Now, I know, yes, it's only 2 games. Yes, the bedwetters are out. Yes, you can throw all of these things at me. Some of the comments were a real mix. People telling, me and others to grow up and get a grip. It's only 2 games. But then I do also think the majority of the conversation I've seen, particularly amongst our community here and on social media generally as well, has been around a kind of concern around whether Brighton are ready. Do we look a little bit undercooked, perhaps? Do we look like we haven't maybe recruited in the most perfect way going into the season, and perhaps are some expectations a little bit too high? Now, certainly, obviously, you think about the first game, Fulham, it was a game where we played pretty well. I think there were a fair few very decent standout performances within that. Rutter looked good, Weaver looked good, Baleba looked good considering he wasn't very fit, minteh looked sharp, Mitoma looked decent, Dekaiver had a good debut. We were generally very positive after that game, weren't we, despite the kind of poor 95th minute, equaliser. Everton less so. I think Everton on Sunday did expose some of the issues around maybe Brighton's squad, maybe some of the tactics, maybe some individual players, and maybe a kind of lack of readiness either on the part of the club, on the part of the players themselves, on the part of the coach, and just kind of on the part of general recruitment. And I think it mainly relates to our striking options, doesn't it? I think if we're just going to cut to the chase on this, I don't think Brighton necessarily, we feel like as fans we're not quite there in the midfield. For a couple of years that has been an issue. I think generally this season we all feel like we're going into the season with a pretty solid midfield with a number of different options. I think in terms of centre half, we've pretty much resolved that despite it not being, not having seen many of the new signings. Fullback's a little bit more of an interesting one, but I think the main problem is around replacing those goals from João Pedro. Now, I've banged the drum for a while. On this channel, I've spoken in recent weeks about how I want to see Danny Welbeck leading the line. Instead of Georginio Rutter, I want to see Rutter drop into a number 10. And clearly, the reason that he hasn't been playing Danny Welbeck is because he's not fit, really. He's not ready. And he absolutely played against Everton as a player who wasn't really fit. That was very obvious. It was probably one of the worst performances Danny Welbeck has ever put in a Brighton shirt, maybe even in his entire career. But I think you've got to put that down to a lack of sharpness, a lack of fitness. I do still think he embodies a very decent option for Brighton going forward up front. I do think that. I think we've seen some of the best of him last season. And I think some of the reactionary responses after that game, while in a way I get them because it was a very poor performance, I think generally if we pull it back, I think he's a good option. I do think though we look a bit blunt. I mean, in this game it highlighted it. Let's take prime Danny Welbeck out of it and just face what we're facing at the moment in terms of the facts. We look blunt. We look like we don't necessarily have a focal point. We look like we're relying on players like minteh and mitoma who can be electric, but particularly someone like minteh kind of blows hot and cold a little bit, and you can't always rely on him to be that outlet. He's great at creating some attacking impetus and getting us up the field, but is he going to be the main man? I think he will be at some point for Brighton, but I think right now, we have lost that central focal point. And I think when you couple it with the fact that someone like Matt O'Reilly, quite clearly, whichever way you have your bread buttered, I think we've got to agree he doesn't look like a ready product right now. I was going to say the finished article. No Brighton player necessarily ever is the finished article, but he doesn't look like that finished article for Brighton, a player who is ready to play at number 10. We've spoken about it before. I'm not going to rehash my thoughts, but the fact that it is a bit slow, it's a bit... I saw someone describe him really, really well the other day. I'm going to have to try and find it. But talking about, I've spoken about his kind of slowness and maybe his ungainliness a little bit, and kind of how it takes him a while. It takes a couple of touches and that ultimately slows him down a little bit. I think he was okay against Everton, but what I don't get is how he's maybe getting that opportunity ahead of someone like a Gruder or a Buonanotte. Gruder getting 5-10 minutes at the end of the game, not even that, probably 5, 6, 7 minutes at the end of the game, where he can't really do much. Buonanotte not even in the matchday squad, yet we're playing players like Matt O'Reilly who look a little bit out of their depth really, and Danny Welbeck who clearly isn't fit. I think we need a bit more energy, a bit more impetus. I think what it maybe does ask the question is, has our expectations been a little bit too high? You know, Fabian Hurzeler in the off-season talking around how our aim was to finish 5th. I think a lot of the conversations we had were around how Brighton are aiming for a top 8, 7, 6th finish this season. That is what Brighton can do with the depth they have. I've spoken for so long around the depth that Brighton have. You know, we have one of the best, most deep attacks in the league. You know, I would stand by that. But you watch us after a game like Everton or during a game like Everton, and you think to yourself, what on earth's going on here? You think it can't just be from losing Adingra and João Pedro that suddenly we look like a completely different side in terms of our attacking ability and creativity. It is kind of just bizarre. You know, minteh, mitoma, good players. Rutter, ready to go. Welbeck, generally ready to go as well. After that, you know, I think what we're doing is we're really relying on Kostulas, Simas and Watson, players who at this point the club haven't deemed ready. And I think it's important that it's not the fact that the club haven't deemed them ready in terms of their ability or in terms of their readiness to play in the Premier League. It's clearly around readiness in terms of fitness. I think that needs to be kind of cleared up, because I think a lot of people maybe tend to think that why the club bought these players if they don't think they're ready for the Premier League. Well, I think they don't think they're ready for the Premier League from a fitness perspective. I think obviously it's about bedding them in and getting young players who have played a fair amount of minutes in the last year or so and have suffered with injuries, around kind of managing them as they move into a league where things are much more intense, and ultimately at this point into a team where it looks like they're going to be relied upon quite a lot. And maybe some of us thought we wouldn't see much of the Greek lads or much of Tommy Watson in this first half of the season because we have so many options. I think it might transpire that someone particularly like Simas will be needed a lot. Now, I think the question is, do Brighton need to go out into the market and maybe get one more attacker, one more proper, ready-to-go striker in that number 9 position? You know, someone like an Evan Ferguson, who is, you know, clearly looking like the real deal in Rome at the moment, getting man of the match in his most recent game against Bologna. A player who's clearly finding his feet again. It feels like we need a player who can come in, and at least in this interim where maybe Danny Welbeck's not quite at his best, Kostulas, Simas clearly aren't ready for the Premier League. What do we do? Because it might be the case, you know, Kostulas, Simas play against Oxford. You know, they play on Wednesday night against Oxford. They look good, and then we bring them into the Premier League, and it's all well and good, but ultimately they're not going to be fit and firing from the first minute, are they? And we could still be in a situation in 2 months' time when we think this it looks a little bit blunt still, and it feels like we need an impetus. You know, are we going to still therefore be relying on Matt O'Reilly because we need we need someone in that 10, because we're having to play Rutter in that 9 because we don't have anyone else? And I do wonder whether this whole Rutter in the number 9 position, Matt O'Reilly in the 10 is, to what extent is it, you know, the necessity, is it the desire of the manager because that's what he thinks is best? He really wants to play Matt O'Reilly in the 10. He really wants to play Rutter in the 9. Or is it necessity? Is it because we're starting the season with a not fit Danny Welbeck, and we obviously saw that evidenced against Everton? Is it because we don't have the other options? We don't have the Greek lads. We don't have Tommy Watson. We don't have other players. Well, we do, though. That's the thing. We've got Gruder. You know, for example, we could have played, I don't know, Gruder and Rutter up front. Okay, it's maybe not posed. When I say that, I kind of make my own point, though, don't I? Because actually, you can't play Gruder up front. So I suppose maybe the reason he is playing O'Reilly and Rutter is because he doesn't have that option. He doesn't have that number 9. What we lost in João Pedro and Welbeck. You know, it's now it would now be Rutter and Welbeck, but then we don't even have Welbeck ready, so it's got to be Rutter and someone else. So I suppose maybe it is a kind of a thing about necessity. I found it interesting that when he spoke in the press after the Everton game, Brian Owen put a little clip out of the question he asked him, saying around, there's lots of talk around the defenders in the press conference at that moment. He said there's a lot of talk about the defenders. What about the attackers? Do you feel like you're a little bit blunt? Do you feel like you need more options? How do you feel about your attacking kind of maybe lack of depth. And he basically said, we made loads of chances in the Everton game. We made really, really good chances and we were just unlucky not to finish them. Then that is true. And I suppose his idea will be that the goals need to be spread across the team, don't they? They come from your wingers, they come from your number 10s, they come from your midfielders. I get that. And to be fair, we saw it in terms of the chances being made. It was Minteh, it was Mitoma, it was Matt O'Reilly, obviously Welbeck with the penalty. Ayari had a couple of opportunities. It shows that they do come from around the team. Maybe it is a case that we were simply just unlucky. I don't know. I think maybe this squad isn't quite ready. I think the team against Everton absolutely looked rusty still, tired, lethargic. And I think we saw that in pre-season as well. Our dips off towards the final 20 minutes. I'm not saying we saw that necessarily against Everton, but the second half, the tempo was very poor. It leads me to think maybe this team aren't maybe ready. I don't know. Look, I'm hoping and I'm believing that in a few games' time we might see things turn around, and maybe we just need to get the cogs moving a little bit in terms of this season getting underway. And they're not necessarily bad results. Everton wasn't a bad result because we maybe telegraphed that this could happen with the new stadium for the Everton fans being up for it, with the players being up for it. And Fulham was probably a decent result, a fair result, a 1-1 draw against Fulham. In any other part of the season, you go, okay, fair enough. I think it's just the time it's come with. I think we've really felt going into this season a real level of momentum, and it's kind of just been, the brakes have been slammed on, and it feels like, oh God, maybe this depth that we all thought we had, and maybe the fact that we all felt we'd be fine without João Pedro, kind of hasn't come to fruition. If the Greek lads had started every game from the start of this season, would we be in a different position? Would we be sat here going, okay, they might have scored goals. They might have looked sharp. We might have been able to bring them off the bench when Danny Welbeck's not playing so well. The game might have looked a bit different. And it does feel like the whole Brighton community right now is hanging their hats on these Greek strikers. And that feels a little bit harsh. It feels a little bit much. And it feels a bit like a promised land that isn't going to happen. However, I feel like it's all we've got to cling to for now. Brighton clearly have options. They've clearly got great players. But I would just love to see a few of them more often. I'd love to see Gruden more often, Buonanotte more often. We've clearly got these options. Obviously, Tommy Watson soon to come. And I'm hoping it will develop. But I'd love to know what you think. Do you think we've maybe undercooked ourselves going into the season? Do you think the squad is ready to challenge for a top 8, top 7, top 6 European football spot? Do you think our expectations have been too high going into this season? Do we need to reassess ourselves, or is this all a bunch of bedwetting and it's actually just a kind of unfortunate and a bit of a slow start to a season after a couple of resolute teams to come up against and fairly difficult games to start the season, with obviously going into a few more difficult games in the next few weeks. And look, let's make no mistake, it could look even worse in a month's time with some of the results we have. And I don't want to seem too doom-mongering, so touch wood, but I suppose it does just ask the question as a fan, and I suppose that's our job, is to talk about how valid some of these questions are. So let me know in the comments, what do you think? Do you agree with what I've said there? Do you feel like we've maybe gone a bit too far? Do you feel like maybe the expectations were a bit too high? I'd love to know your thoughts. I will be back after the Oxford game to talk all about that, and hopefully the debuts, the proper full debuts, maybe not full debuts, but the proper first team debuts of Charalampos Kostilas and Stefanos Tsimas against Oxford United in the Carabao Cup second round. I will see you after that. Thank you very much for watching. And as always, up the Albion.